I was the color of invisibility. It was not a grand, dramatic emptiness, but the dull, serviceable gray of a forgotten corner, the dusty beige of a book left unread on a high shelf. I had learned to wear this color as a shield, to fold myself into the seams of a room until I was nothing more than a shadow on the wall, a trick of the light. But on the eve of the Duchess of Ainsworth's annual ball, my shield had become my cage. "She simply cannot be seen," my stepmother, Lady Beatrice, was saying. Her voice, a confection of honey and steel, carried easily from the drawing room to the dim hallway where I stood, frozen. "Not tonight. Not when Rosamund is to be presented. Can you imagine? It would be like placing a wren next to a bird of paradise. The comparison would be unfortunate." My father, a man long since hollowed out by his desire for a quiet life, murmured something indistinct. A sigh, perhaps. A concession. "Deteio." "It is not cruelty, my dear Lord Ashworth," Beatrice continued, her tone sharpening just enough for me to feel the prick of it through the thick oak door. "It is practicality. With Alara hovering in the background, all pale and serious, she will only distract from Rosamund's radiance. We must secure a formidable match for Rosamund this season. Everything depends on it. Alara's situation can be dealt with later. Quietly. Her situation. I was a situation. A problem to be managed. At 20 years of age, 2 years Rosamund's senior, I was already a spinster in the eyes of society, and in the far more critical eyes of my stepmother. Rosamund was the sun, all golden hair and effortless laughter, the daughter of Beatrice's own heart and womb. I was the lingering shadow of my father's first wife, a woman I barely remembered, save for the scent of lavender and the weight of a small, gentle hand on my hair. The final plan was more brutal than simply leaving me at home. It was a calculated act of erasure. Beatrice, in a gesture of what she would publicly call uncommon kindness, had arranged a betrothal for me. Not to a man of standing, but to Lord Fenwick, a gout-ridden widower thrice my age with a cruel mouth and hands that were said to wander with impunity. The arrangement was to be announced tonight, at the ball. A neat, tidy disposal. Rosamund's path would be cleared of my drab presence, and the family would be rid of its burden. I retreated from the door, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I did not weep. Tears were a luxury I had learned long ago I could not afford. They drew attention, and attention brought only pain. Instead, I went to my room, a small, north-facing chamber at the back of the house, and looked at my only true possessions. A compass, a ruler, and a stack of paper covered in the clean, precise lines of architectural drawings. They were my secret world, designs for bridges that could span impossible chasms and cathedrals with spires that pierced the clouds. I published essays on structural integrity under a male pseudonym, E. Archer, in a niche academic journal. It was my only voice, the only place I existed as more than a ghost. That night I was dressed in a gown the color of dishwater, a cast-off of Rosamund's that had been inexpertly altered to fit my slender frame. Beatrice looked me over with a critical eye, her lips tightening. "It will have to do. Try not to slouch, Alara, and for heaven's sake, stay near the back of the ballroom. Lord Fenwick knows where to find you." The ballroom at Ainsworth House was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and shimmering silks. The air was thick with perfume and the buzz of 100 conversations. I felt my invisibility cloak settle around me, a familiar weight. I found a shadowed alcove behind a monstrous potted fern and wished I could melt into the damask wallpaper. Rosamund was already the center of a constellation of admirers, her laughter like the ringing of tiny silver bells. My father stood beside Beatrice, his smile fixed and glassy. They looked like a perfect family, a portrait from which one figure had been clumsily cut away. I watched them, a dull ache spreading through me. It was not jealousy of Rosamund. She was not unkind, merely oblivious, swimming happily in the warm waters of approval I had never been allowed to enter. It was a deeper, more profound sorrow for the self I might have been, had I been seen, had I been wanted. Then the music faltered. A hush fell over the room, a wave of silence that started at the grand entrance and rippled outwards. He had arrived. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, a man spoken of only in whispers. He was impossibly wealthy, ruthlessly powerful, and a complete recluse. He had not attended a social event in London for 5 years, not since the tragic death of his younger brother. They said he was cold, severe, a man made of marble and shadows. He stood in the doorway, tall and severe in his black evening dress, his presence sucking the very air from the room. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, his eyes a startling pale gray that seemed to miss nothing. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Every hostess in London had tried and failed to lure the Duke from his fortress of a home. Why was he here? And why tonight? Beatrice was practically vibrating with excitement. I saw her hand tighten on my father's arm, her mind surely racing with the possibility of introducing Rosamund to the greatest prize in the kingdom. The Duke ignored the fluttering fans and the sycophantic smiles of the Duchess of Ainsworth. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and cool. It was the look of a man searching for something, and utterly uninterested in everything else. I shrank further into my alcove, my one desire to remain unseen. This was a predator of a different order, and my simple camouflage felt suddenly inadequate. But then, the impossible happened. His eyes, those piercing gray stones, moved past the glittering diamonds and radiant beauties, past Rosamund's sunlit circle, past my triumphant stepmother, and they found me. They found me, huddled behind the fern. For a moment I was certain I was mistaken. He must be looking at the tapestry behind me, or the statue in the corner, but his gaze did not move. It held mine across the expanse of the ballroom, and in that look, there was no pity, no disdain, no confusion. There was only a still, unnerving focus, an acknowledgement. I felt a tremor run through me, a terrifying crack in the frozen surface of my composure. He saw me. Ignoring the Duchess, who was speaking to him with an animated expression, the Duke began to walk. He did not move toward the center of the room. He moved in a straight, unwavering line, directly toward my corner. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. Whispers followed in his wake, a susurrus of shock and disbelief. Who was he walking toward? What was happening? My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This could not be happening. It was a mistake, a cruel joke. He would stop, turn, speak to someone else. He did not stop. He came to a halt directly in front of me, so close I could see the fine silver threads in his black hair at his temples. The entire ballroom had fallen silent. 1,000 pairs of eyes were now fixed on the forgotten corner, on the girl in the dishwater dress. I was no longer invisible. I was hideously, terrifyingly exposed. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to command the very air around it. It cut through the silence with absolute authority. I could not speak. I could only stare up at him, my mind a blank slate of panic. He seemed to understand. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible bow. I believe I was promised a dance. I saw my stepmother's face over his shoulder. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with fury and confusion. Lord Fenwick, who had been lumbering his way toward me, had stopped dead in his tracks, his florid face turning a shade of purple. I do not dance, Your Grace," I managed to stammer, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Then you will do me the honor of accompanying me to the terrace," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He held out his arm. It was not a request. It was a summons. To refuse would be an unthinkable insult. To accept was to step into a world I did not understand, to invite a kind of attention that felt more dangerous than any scorn. With a hand that trembled so violently I was sure he must feel it, I placed my fingers on the black wool of his sleeve. The fabric was fine and cool beneath my touch. As he led me from the alcove, a path cleared before us. The whispers erupted into a roar of speculation. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate pattern of the parquet, feeling the heat of 1,000 stares on my skin. He led me not to the main terrace, crowded with gossiping couples, but through a side door to a small, secluded balcony overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a relief against my burning cheeks. Below us, the formal gardens were a labyrinth of silver and black in the moonlight. "My apologies for the theatrics," the Duke said, his voice softer now that we were alone. "It was the most efficient way to extricate you." I finally found the courage to look at him. "Extricate me, Your Grace?" "From the potted fern," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his severe lips, "and from Lord Fenwick." My stomach twisted. "You know of... I make it my business to know many things, Miss Ashworth," he said, turning to lean against the balustrade, his profile sharp against the night sky. "Including the announcement Lady Beatrice intended to make this evening. I found the arrangement distasteful." I stared at him, my mind reeling. How could he know, and why would he care? This was the Duke of Blackwood, a man who could make or break fortunes with a single word. My pathetic little arranged marriage was of no consequence to him. Why? The word was barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the night it sounded like a shout. He turned his head, his pale eyes meeting mine. "Because waste is the only true sin," he said, his voice low and intense, "and to chain a mind like yours to a brute like Fenwick would be an unforgivable waste." My mind. He had said my mind. Not my face, not my name, not my connections. He had seen something no one else had ever bothered to look for. The shock of it was so profound. I felt dizzy. You cannot know anything of my mind, Your Grace," I said, clutching the cold stone of the balcony railing to steady myself. "Can I not, Mr. Archer?" he asked quietly. The world tilted on its axis. The name, my secret name, spoken aloud in his deep voice, struck me with the force of a physical blow. I swayed, my knuckles white on the railing. My secret was out. My one small private world had been breached. I felt a surge of pure terror, followed by a wave of inexplicable, terrifying hope. He saw the panic in my eyes. "Your secret is safe," he said quickly, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "I am perhaps your only reader. The journal is rather obscure." He paused. "Your essay on the tensile strength of suspension bridges was revolutionary. Your calculations on load distribution were elegant." Elegant. He had called my mathematics elegant. No one had ever called anything about me elegant. I was plain, quiet, serious Alara. But E. Archer. E. Archer was elegant. E. Archer was revolutionary. "How did you know?" I breathed. "I have my methods," he said simply. "When I learned that E. Archer was the forgotten stepdaughter of Lord Ashworth and that she was to be sold off to a man like Fenwick, I decided to intervene. I was trapped in a state of unreality, the glittering ballroom a distant, muffled memory. The most powerful man in England had sought me out, because he had read my academic essays. It was too fantastic to believe, a plot from a novel, not a chapter from my own drab life. I began to tremble, not from cold, but from the sheer overwhelming force of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. "What? What do you want, Your Grace?" I asked, my voice shaking. "For now," he said, his gaze unwavering, "a conversation, uninterrupted." He gestured back toward the ballroom, where I could see the frantic, furious face of my stepmother peering through the glass. "I have sent a footman to inform your father that you are under my protection for the remainder of the evening, and that I will be calling on you tomorrow. At 11. Under his protection. The words were a shield, stronger than any I could have fashioned for myself. He had not asked permission. He had simply stated a fact, rearranging my world with a few quiet words. "Tomorrow," I repeated, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "At 11, he confirmed. "We have a great deal to discuss. Bridges, for a start." The days that followed were a study in guarded wonder. My stepmother was a storm cloud of fury, but her anger was impotent against the Duke's decree. He had thrown a mantle of impenetrable power around me, and she could do nothing but rage in private. My father avoided my eyes, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of respect in his expression. Rosamund looked at me with a newfound curiosity, as if seeing me for the first time as a person and not just a piece of household furniture. The Duke's carriage, a severe black-lacquered coach, emblazoned with a silver wolf's head, arrived at precisely 11 the next morning. I was ushered into his presence in our own shabby drawing room, a room that seemed to shrink and fade around his formidable frame. I was terrified. The hope that had flickered on the balcony now felt like a dangerous fire, one that could consume me. I expected this to be a whim, a passing amusement for a bored nobleman. I steeled myself for the inevitable disappointment, for the moment he would grow tired of his game and cast me back into the shadows. He did not play games. He was direct, his questions precise. He spoke to me not as a young woman to be flattered or charmed, but as an intellectual peer. He had brought my essay with him, the pages marked with his own neat, decisive handwriting. "Your theory on harmonic resonance," he began, dispensing with pleasantries. "It's sound, but you failed to account for the secondary oscillations caused by wind shear at high altitudes. It's a common oversight." I forgot to be afraid. I forgot my shabby dress and my lowly position. I was Archer, and my theory was being challenged. "Only in a unidirectional wind," I countered, my voice gaining strength. "If you factor in turbulent eddies, the dampening effect of the vertical suspension cables would negate those oscillations. It's in the corollary on page 12. A slow, appreciative light dawned in his pale eyes. "So it is," he murmured. "I missed that." That first meeting in our drawing room stretched into 2 hours. The next day, I was invited to his home, Blackwood Manor, under the guise of consulting him on a new wing he planned to build. My stepmother could not object. A summons from a duke was a royal command. His library was my vision of heaven. It was a vast 2-story chamber, walled with books from floor to ceiling, with a rolling ladder and the scent of old paper and leather. It was a fortress of knowledge, and for the first time since my mother's death, I felt I was home. He watched me as I took it all in, my hands clasped before me, to stop myself from running my fingers along the spines of the books. "I had a feeling you would appreciate this room," he said. In that library, over the course of weeks, the guarded acquaintance between us began to deepen into something more. We spoke of everything and nothing. We argued over Palladian symmetry and the structural genius of Gothic buttresses. He would push a book into my hands, a rare text on Roman aqueducts, a new translation of Vitruvius, and watch my face as I read the first page. He began to reveal small pieces of himself. His solitude, he explained, was not born of arrogance, but of grief. His younger brother, Thomas, had been his only true friend. He, too, had been a brilliant architect, a visionary. "He died inspecting the construction of a bridge," Alistair said one afternoon, his voice low and rough. We were standing by a large window overlooking the grounds, the light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. A faulty calculation. A support gave way. He was gone. He did not look at me, but stared out at the unyielding green of the lawn. For 5 years I could not bear to look at a blueprint. The very language we shared became a source of pain. I felt a profound ache of empathy for him. "Until you read an essay on suspension bridges in an obscure journal," I said softly. He turned to me then, and the mask of the severe, unfeeling Duke was gone. In its place was a man marked by loss, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. Until I heard his voice again. "In your words," he confirmed, "the same passion, the same elegance." My heart, which I had guarded for so long, began to betray me. It beat faster when he entered a room. I found myself sketching his profile in the margins of my notebooks instead of calculating stress points. This connection, born of shared intellect, was becoming something deeper, something that frightened me with its intensity. He offered small, practical kindnesses that spoke volumes. He noticed I shivered in the drafty halls of my own home, and a heavy cashmere shawl was delivered the next day. He learned from a servant that I often missed meals due to my stepmother's forgetfulness, and suddenly elaborate trays of food would arrive from his kitchens whenever I was invited to the manor. He never mentioned these things. They simply happened, quiet acts of care that made me feel cherished in a way I had never known. One rainy afternoon in the library, we were poring over a set of old blueprints. I reached for a magnifying glass at the same time he did. Our hands brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, and his fingers gently closed around mine. His touch was warm and firm. He held my hand for a long moment, his thumb stroking softly over my knuckles. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. I looked up at him, and the intensity in his gaze stole my breath. He had a beautiful mouth, I realized with a jolt. Severe, yes, but beautifully shaped. I wondered what it would feel like to see him smile, a true, unguarded smile. He slowly released my hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin for hours. A boundary had been crossed. The polite fiction of our professional collaboration was dissolving, revealing the powerful, terrifying current of emotion that flowed beneath it. And I was not the only one who noticed. My stepmother, Beatrice, had been watching the progression of my visits to Blackwood Manor with a growing sense of panic. Her plan to marry Rosamund to a wealthy suitor was floundering. The Duke's inexplicable interest in me had become the talk of the season, and my newfound status as his protégé eclipsed Rosamund's debut. I had, in my quiet way, stolen her daughter's spotlight, and Beatrice could not abide it. Her initial strategy was to belittle the connection. "A pet project," she would say with a brittle laugh at tea parties. "The poor Duke is so eccentric. He has taken an interest in the girl's little scribbles. A charitable act, really." But when the Duke himself began accompanying me to the opera or for walks in the park, always chaperoned, always impeccably proper, yet undeniably intimate, the narrative of a pet project began to wear thin. The way he looked at me, the way he leaned in to hear my quiet comments, the way he shielded me from the prying eyes of the ton, it was not the behavior of a man engaged in charity. Beatrice saw her ambitions turning to ash. The grand match for Rosamund was slipping away, and the worthless stepdaughter she had planned to discard was now at the center of the most powerful man in England's attention. Her control was gone. She decided she had to act decisively and cruelly. I was in my room one evening, trying to concentrate on a design for a new public library, when my stepsister Rosamund knocked and entered, a rare occurrence. She looked distressed, her usual sunny disposition clouded over. "Alara," she began, twisting a lace handkerchief in her hands, "I heard Mama speaking with her solicitor. She is angry about you and the Duke." "She is always angry," I said quietly, setting down my pencil. "No, this is different," Rosamund insisted. "She said she would not be made a fool of. She said she would put an end to this farce and remind the Duke exactly what you are." A chill went through me. What did she mean? Rosamund shook her head, her eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in them before. "I don't know. But she was writing a letter, a long one, and she was smiling while she wrote it, that terrible, sharp little smile she gets." I knew that smile. It was the smile she wore just before she delivered her most cutting remarks, the smile she had worn when she told me about Lord Fenwick. 2 days later, the Duke's customary invitation did not arrive. Silence stretched through the morning. By afternoon, a knot of pure dread had formed in my stomach. The hope I had so foolishly allowed to bloom was withering. Of course, it was too good to be true. He had tired of me. The novelty had worn off. Or worse. A messenger arrived late that afternoon, not with an invitation, but with a curt, formal note addressed to my father. It was a summons. My father, my stepmother, and I were to present ourselves at Blackwood Manor the following morning at 10. The note was brief, cold, and signed with the Duke's severe, slashing signature. Beatrice was triumphant. "You see," she said, her voice dripping with venom as she read the note over my father's shoulder, "the game is over. He has seen you for what you are. He is likely calling us to apologize for the trouble his little pet has caused." She looked at me, her eyes glittering with malice. "I hope you enjoyed your moment in the sun, Alara. Winter has come." I spent the night in a state of cold terror. She had done it. She had sent her letter, filled with poison and lies, and he had believed her. He must have. Why else would he summon my entire family for a formal audience? He was going to cast me aside publicly to restore social order. The humiliation would be absolute, 100 times worse than the betrothal to Fenwick, because this time I had allowed myself to hope. I had allowed myself to feel. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor was silent and suffocating. My father stared out the window, his face pale. Beatrice sat ramrod straight, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. I felt numb, wrapped in the old familiar cloak of invisibility, preparing for the final killing blow. We were not shown to the library. We were led to the Duke's private study, a severe, masculine room dominated by a massive desk of dark, polished mahogany. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, his back to us, staring into the flames. He did not turn when we entered. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mistress Gable, who had always treated me with a quiet kindness, showed us to 3 chairs placed uncomfortably in the center of the room, like an inquisition. Then she left, closing the heavy doors behind her with a soft, final click. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Beatrice shifted in her seat, her confidence beginning to waver in the face of the Duke's unnerving stillness. Finally he turned. His face was carved from ice. The warmth I had come to know, the light in his eyes when we spoke of architecture, was gone. He looked every inch the ruthless, unapproachable Duke of his reputation. My heart sank to the floor. It was over. He held a letter in his hand. "I received a piece of correspondence 2 days ago," he began, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was anonymous, but the contents were most illuminating. He looked directly at Beatrice, whose smile had frozen on her face. It purported to be from a concerned friend of the family. He began to read from the letter, his voice a cold, cutting monotone. "Your Grace, you must be warned. The girl, Alara, is not what she seems. She is a cunning, manipulative creature, deeply unstable, who has long harbored a pathological jealousy of her beautiful, good-natured stepsister. She has fabricated this interest in intellectual pursuits to prey on your known sympathies and entrap you in a most unsuitable alliance. She is prone to flights of fancy and melancholic fits. For your own sake, and for the sake of her long-suffering family, you must sever all contact." Every word was a lash. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could feel my stepmother's triumphant gaze on me, even without looking at her. The Duke lowered the letter. He looked at me, his face an unreadable mask. "Is this true, Miss Ashworth? Are you a cunning, manipulative creature?" I could not find my voice. I could only shake my head, a small, pathetic gesture of denial. I felt the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, tears of humiliation and utter despair. "I see," he said coldly. He then turned his gaze to my stepmother. "Lady Beatrice, a terrible accusation has been made against your stepdaughter. You have known her all her life. Is there any truth to these claims? Is she unstable? Is she manipulative?" Beatrice seized her moment. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her performance flawless. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling with false sorrow, "it pains me to admit it, but the girl, she has always been difficult. So unlike my Rosamund, we have tried, truly we have, but this obsession with you, it is an embarrassment. We are so very grateful you have seen the truth before any real damage was done." The Duke listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and picked up another set of papers. "Thank you for your honesty, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice still chillingly calm. "It is so helpful to have one's assessments confirmed." He looked down at the papers in his hand. "Which is why I took the liberty of having my own men conduct an inquiry after receiving this helpful letter." Beatrice's face went rigid. "It is a curious thing," the Duke continued, his voice taking on a sharp, dangerous edge. "Investigations often uncover the most unexpected details. For instance, my men looked into the financial arrangements made after the First Lady Ashworth's death." He looked up, his pale eyes pinning my father to his chair. "Lord Ashworth, were you aware that your first wife's dowry, a considerable sum meant to be held in trust for her daughter, Alara, was never placed in trust at all?" My father stared, dumbfounded. "What? That cannot be. The papers were all handled. They were handled by your new wife, Lady Beatrice," the Duke supplied, his voice like the crack of a whip, "who, it seems, transferred the entire sum into her own personal accounts over the course of several years. Funds she used to pay her own dressmaker's bills, her gambling debts, and to finance her daughter's extravagant debut season." Beatrice leaped to her feet. "Lies! These are vicious lies! How dare you?" "I have the bank ledgers right here," the Duke said, tapping the papers on his desk, "and a signed confession from the solicitor who aided you in the fraud. He was remarkably forthcoming when faced with the prospect of disbarment and a lengthy prison sentence. He turned his gaze, now blazing with a cold fire, onto my stepmother. You call Alara manipulative? You, who have been systematically stealing this girl's inheritance since she was a child? You, who tried to sell her to a degenerate like Fenwick to cover your tracks? The room was silent, save for Beatrice's ragged breathing. Her mask of gentility had shattered, revealing the snarling, desperate creature beneath. She is nothing, she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. A plain, worthless nobody. She deserved nothing. And then, something inside me broke, not in weakness, but in strength. The years of silence, of swallowing insults, of folding myself into nothingness. They fell away. The Duke had not rescued me. He had handed me a sword. I stood up, my own voice clear and steady in the ringing silence. No, I said. All eyes turned to me. I am not nothing, I said, looking directly at the woman who had tormented me for a decade. I am the daughter of Eleanor Ashworth. I am the mind that you tried to starve and lock away in a dusty room. You called me a wren, but you were the one who was terrified I might learn to fly. You stole my mother's money, but you could not steal her legacy. You could not steal her mind, which she gave to me. I turned to my father, who looked at me as if he had never seen me before. And you, I said, my voice shaking with a sorrow more profound than anger. You let her do it. For a quiet life, you sacrificed your own daughter. You saw her cruelty, and you looked away. My father flinched as if struck. He buried his face in his hands. I wept. Finally, I turned to the Duke. The ice in his expression had melted, replaced by a fierce, blazing pride. He had known. He had known I had this strength within me. He had simply cleared the field so I could find it. Beatrice let out a strangled sob of pure rage and defeat. She was ruined, publicly, financially, socially. The Duke's evidence was irrefutable. Her reign of petty tyranny was over. Mistress Gable, the Duke said, his voice ringing with authority. The door opened instantly. Please show Lord Ashworth and Lady Beatrice out. Alara will be staying here. My father, his face streaked with tears, looked at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words would not come. He only gave a broken nod and allowed himself to be led away. Beatrice shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred before she was escorted from the room, a disgraced queen deposed from her cardboard throne. As the door closed, a profound silence descended. I stood in the center of the room, trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. The weight of a decade of oppression had been lifted, and I felt dizzyingly light. Alistair, the Duke, did not move from his desk. He simply watched me, his expression soft. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. A single tear, not of sorrow but of catharsis, traced a path down my cheek. He crossed the room and gently, with the tip of his finger, wiped it away. I knew you were not a wren, Alara, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. I always knew you were an eagle. Later that day, he took me away from the oppressive stillness of the manor. We rode out to a high, windswept ridge that overlooked the entire estate, the green fields rolling away to meet the blue haze of the horizon. The wind whipped strands of hair across my face and tore at my skirts, but it felt clean, purifying. We stood in silence for a long time, simply breathing in the vastness of the sky. The turmoil of the morning felt a world away. Here, there was only the wind and the solid earth beneath our feet. My father's solicitor will see to the return of your inheritance, Alistair said, his voice calm and steady beside me. You will be a woman of independent means. You will be free to go wherever you wish, to study, to build your bridges. I looked out at the horizon, a future I had never dared to imagine stretching before me. It was a terrifying and exhilarating prospect. But as I pictured it, I realized with a sudden sharp pang that the picture was incomplete. It was a landscape devoid of a crucial feature, him. Alistair, I said, using his first name for the first time. It felt right, natural. He turned to me, his pale eyes searching my face. Thank you, I said, the words wholly inadequate, for seeing me. I have been seeing you for a very long time, Alara, he replied, his voice soft, long before we ever met. I saw you in the elegant precision of your work, in the fierce intelligence that refused to be silenced. I did not rescue you today. I only held a mirror up to the strength that was already there. He took a step closer, taking both of my hands in his His were warm and strong, a safe harbor. "I do not want you to be free to go wherever you wish," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "That is a lie. I want you to stay with me." My heart stopped. I have lived in a world of shadows for 5 years," he continued, his gaze holding mine, fierce and vulnerable all at once. "And then I read your words, and it was like the first ray of dawn. You are the architect of things that last, Alara. I want to build a life with you, not as a duke offering protection to a ward, but as a man who has found his equal, as a partner, as your husband." It was not a declaration of flowery passion. It was a statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground we stood on. He was proposing a partnership of mind and soul. He was not saving me from my past. He was inviting me into a shared future. Tears filled my eyes again, but this time they were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes." A smile, a true, breathtaking smile, finally broke across his severe face, transforming it completely. It was like watching the sun rise over a winter landscape. He lifted his hand and gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. "Alara," he breathed, as if my name were a prayer, and then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of arrival. It tasted of the clean wind and a profound, bone-deep recognition. It was the end of a very long winter, and the first day of the rest of my life. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of the new west wing of Blackwood Manor. Our wing. I had designed it, and Alistair had overseen its construction. It was a structure of light and air, with soaring windows and clean, elegant lines, a testament to our shared vision. In my hand, I held not a sketch of a building, but a new design, a cradle. Alistair came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We looked out over the gardens, now bursting with late summer blooms. My father, a quieter, more thoughtful man, had visited the week before, his remorse a tangible thing between us. We were slowly, cautiously, building a new bridge between us. Rosamund, now married to a decent country baronet she had chosen for herself, wrote to me every week. Beatrice was a distant memory, living in disgraced exile in Bath, her name never mentioned. "What are you thinking about?" Alistair murmured, his lips against my hair. I leaned back against the solid warmth of him, my hand covering his over my rounding belly. I thought of the girl in the dishwater dress, hiding behind a potted fern, believing herself to be the color of invisibility. She seemed like a character from a sad story I had read a long, long time ago. "I was just thinking," I said softly, turning my head to kiss him, "about the structural integrity of happiness." He smiled against my lips. "And what is your conclusion, my brilliant wife?" "The foundations," I whispered, "are everything." And I knew, with a certainty that was as strong and unyielding as the stone beneath our feet, that ours were built to last forever.